At the New Year's Eve trip, our friend group had taken to the same mountain lodge for 6 years running. My girlfriend rejected a proposal I hadn't even managed to make yet, in front of everyone we'd known since college, by telling the room she wanted a life, not a nap. I had a ring in my jacket pocket. I never got to take it out. 11 months later, the man she left with that night was exposed online as a fraud who'd been engaged to someone else the entire time. Her name and photo ended up attached to his scandal in 3 separate viral threads. She lost her job over it, and I was standing at the same lodge, at the same party a year to the night, when she asked if there was any way back to me. This is what happened in between. Naomi and I had been together 5 years by that New Year's. We'd met in our last year of college and built the kind of relationship people call solid, which I think she'd started to hear as a synonym for boring, somewhere along the way, though she never said it outright until that night. I'd planned the proposal for weeks. Our friend Sam and his fiancée Vivienne hosted the same lodge trip every winter, the same 8 or 9 of us, the same tradition of watching the fireworks off the back deck at midnight. I'd talked to Sam privately in November, asked if I could borrow 5 minutes of the countdown for something. He'd grinned and said the deck was mine whenever I wanted it. I had the ring sized to a bracelet of hers. I'd stolen a measurement from 3 months earlier. I thought I had this covered. The trouble arrived 2 days before New Year's in the form of Vivienne's cousin's boyfriend, a man named Kai Bardo, who none of us had met before that trip. He showed up with a duffel bag, a jawline that looked professionally maintained, and it turned out 400,000 followers on an account where he free-soloed cliff faces and narrated his own courage in a low, practiced voice. He wasn't loud in the way some people are loud. He was quiet in a way that made a room lean toward him to hear better, which is its own kind of loud. Within an hour of arriving, he'd told a story about nearly dying on a route in Patagonia that had every single person at that table, including me, briefly forgetting to blink. Naomi laughed at all the right places. I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm, a small discomfort you can't quite name yet. Over the next 2 days, I watched her orbit shift a few degrees at a time. She started asking him questions instead of waiting for him to finish talking. She borrowed his opinion on things she used to have her own opinions about. On the second night, we all went out to the hot tub, and I watched her laugh at something he said with her head thrown back, a laugh I hadn't heard aimed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was harmless, the way you tell yourself a lot of things in the days before you're proven catastrophically wrong. New Year's Eve itself started fine. We had dinner together, the whole group, wine flowing, the fireplace going. Around 11, I caught Sam's eye across the room, and he gave me a small nod, our signal, and I felt the ring box in my pocket like a held breath. At a few minutes to midnight, everyone drifted out to the deck with drinks and blankets, the fireworks display from the town below just starting to pop against the dark. I'd worked out a moment, right after the countdown, right as everyone was hugging and shouting Happy New Year, when I'd pull Naomi a few steps away and ask her. The countdown happened. 10, 9, 8. I remember reaching for her hand and finding it already half-turned toward Kai, who was standing just behind her, close enough that his voice landed low against her ear about something I never heard. 3, 2, 1. Fireworks went up over the valley, and in the noise and the hugging and the general chaos of 9 drunk friends screaming Happy New Year at once, I heard Naomi say loudly, to no one and everyone, that she couldn't keep living like this. I asked her what she meant, my hand still half extended toward the pocket with the ring in it, and she turned to face the whole deck, not just me, and said that being with me felt like already being retired, that she wanted a life, not a nap. That watching Kai talk about the things he'd actually done with his one life for the past 2 days had made her realize she'd been asleep for years and hadn't noticed. She said all of this the way you'd read something off a card you'd been rehearsing quietly in your head for a while, and I understood, standing there with a ring I never got to show anyone, that this hadn't started 2 days ago at all. It had just finally found its excuse. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably 4 or 5 seconds. The fireworks kept going, oblivious, lighting everyone's stunned faces gold and then dark and then gold again. Kai had the decency to look mildly uncomfortable, which is the only decent thing I can say about him. Naomi didn't wait for a response. She said she needed some air, which was a strange thing to say on an outdoor deck, and walked toward the far railing, and Kai, after a beat, followed her. I stood there with 8 friends who all suddenly found their drinks extremely interesting, and I put the ring box back deep in my pocket, and I said, into the silence, that I was going to head to bed, and I meant it as flatly and calmly as I could manage, and I went inside. I didn't sleep that night, not really. I lay in the guest room I'd been sharing with her, listening for the door, and around 2 in the morning I heard her come in, quiet, careful, probably trying not to wake me, which told me everything about how she expected this conversation to go if we had it right then. I let her think I was asleep. In the morning, I told Sam I needed to head back early, some excuse about work, and he didn't push, though the look on his face said he already understood there was no version of work involved. I packed my bag while Naomi was still asleep, left a short note that said only that I'd see her back at the apartment when she got home, and drove the 3 hours back to the city with the radio off the entire way, replaying the sentence, "Being with you feels like already being retired," until it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like information. I didn't confront her when she got back 2 days later. I didn't need to. I'd used the drive home to make a decision, the kind that doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, but turns out to be the only one that matters. I told her calmly, standing in our kitchen, that I thought she'd already made her choice on that deck, and that I wasn't going to spend the next however many years auditioning to become someone louder. She cried, said it wasn't like that, said she'd had too much wine, said Kai meant nothing. I believed the crying was real. I didn't believe it changed anything. I spent the next week finding a sublet, moving my things out in careful, unhurried trips while she was at work, the same methodical calm I'd apparently been storing up my whole life for exactly this occasion. I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything. I just left, piece by piece, until the apartment held less and less of me, and then none. For a while nothing happened, which was its own kind of ending. She texted a handful of times over the following month. Apologies mostly, a few attempts to explain the deck as some kind of temporary insanity brought on by champagne and a stranger's charisma. I answered plainly when I answered at all, and eventually she stopped, and I let myself believe that was simply how this story ended, quietly, without a second act. I was wrong about that, though not in the way either of us expected. Kai Bardo, it turned out, had been building his entire following on top of a lie roughly the size of Patagonia itself. Almost a year later, a climbing YouTuber with a much smaller but much more meticulous audience published a 2-hour video, the kind with timestamps and side-by-side footage comparisons, proving that at least a dozen of Kai's most famous solo ascents had actually been shot with rope systems digitally removed in post, coordinated with a small production team he'd never disclosed, on routes far less dangerous than the ones he claimed. The video went everywhere. Sponsors dropped him within days. And buried in the wreckage, almost as an afterthought to the bigger story, was the detail that finally connected back to me. A woman in another state had come forward, furious, saying she'd been engaged to Kai for the past 2 years, the entire time he'd been away on his solo trips, and that she'd found messages and photos on a shared cloud account that placed a woman named Naomi at a mountain lodge with him the previous New Year's, among others. Someone screenshotted it. Someone else recognized her from a wellness brand she did part-time ambassador work for. Within a week, her name was floating around the edges of a scandal that had nothing to do with her original life and everything to do with 2 days she'd spent orbiting the wrong person. The wellness brand quietly ended the partnership. A few of her closest friends stopped answering her calls, not because they blamed her exactly, but because proximity to a public mess is its own kind of contagious. I found out about all of it the same way most people did, scrolling through something a mutual friend had shared, and I felt, honestly, less satisfaction than I expected to. Mostly I felt tired on her behalf, the specific tiredness of watching someone get burned by exactly the thing they reached for. Theo, one of the friends from the lodge trip, called me that week half expecting me to be thrilled. I told him I wasn't thrilled. I was just done being surprised by any of it. And he laughed and said that was somehow a more savage response than gloating would have been. I didn't feel savage. I felt like a person standing a safe distance from a fire he used to live inside of. Naomi called twice that month. I let both calls go to voicemail. The messages weren't angry, which surprised me. They were smaller than that, quieter, the sound of someone realizing all at once how much she'd traded for 2 days of feeling interesting to a stranger. I didn't call back. Not out of cruelty. I genuinely didn't know what I would have said that would have helped either of us. And I'd learned, standing on that deck a year earlier, that silence when you don't yet have the right words is better than noise you'll regret. The lodge trip came around again in December, the 7th year of the tradition, and Sam texted the group chat as he did every year. Same place, same dates, bring your own noisemakers. I almost didn't go. I went anyway, partly because I'd built a life over the past year that I genuinely wanted to bring somewhere, including a woman named Iris I'd been seeing since the spring. Someone who laughed at things because they were funny, and not because someone with a following was watching. She came with me, met the friend group for the first time, charmed Vivian within about 10 minutes over a shared opinion about board games, and I watched my own life continue existing in a place that used to only contain the version of it that had ended there. Naomi arrived on the second night, invited by Vivian out of an old loyalty I understood even if it complicated my evening. She looked different, not diminished exactly, just quieter, the specific quiet of someone who'd spent a year being talked about, instead of listened to. We were polite to each other across the dinner table, the kind of politeness that takes real effort from both people. It wasn't until close to midnight, almost exactly a year to the hour, since the last time we'd stood on that same deck, that she found me alone for a moment near the drinks table, while Iris was outside laughing at something with Vivian, and asked carefully if there was any version of this where we tried again, now that she understood what she'd actually had. I thought about the ring, still sitting in a drawer in my new apartment because I'd never had the heart to return it, an artifact of a moment that never got to finish happening. I told her that I didn't think there was a version of that, and that this wasn't punishment. It was just the truth of a year that had moved a long way past that deck for both of us. I told her I was glad she seemed to understand now what she hadn't understood then, but that understanding it a year late doesn't reopen a door, it just explains why it closed. She nodded, and to her credit she didn't push, didn't cry, didn't reach for the version of this scene where I was supposed to forgive her because she'd finally learned the lesson the hard way. She just said she was sorry, and meant it, and went to find her coat. At midnight, the fireworks went up over the same valley, and I stood on the same deck with Iris's hand in mine instead of a ring box in my pocket. And when everyone shouted Happy New Year into the cold, I wasn't performing calm the way I had been the year before. I was actually calm, which turned out to be a completely different feeling, one that had taken me all year, and one very specific unraveling that had nothing to do with me, to finally understand the difference.